Actually, it's set for 30 seconds by the looks of it, so they're going to come in quicker than you thought. 5 seconds left.
So, welcome back. I think everybody can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Good. So I hope you had a very good discussion, and we try to remember the time when we had enough time for networking before Corona. So I hope that you had a good chance to network again. So I think for those that they don't know me, because I think most of you know me already, my name is Ali Laleparvar. I'm working for BASF, but I'm a member of CoreNet since 2012, and I have a chance to be in the board committee since 2016, and I don't have any special assignment, but sometimes I will jump in, jump out for so-called special projects, and I'm happy to be with you today. And I'm also honored to introduce our speaker, our great speaker today, Andres Ring. And as a just introduction, he studied in University of Passau. I hope, Andres, I pronounced this university correctly, in Germany. And this University of Passau is one of the top position ranking in Germany or in the world for law, business, economy, and I think politics as well. And of course, Andres is not politician, but the university was very famous for that. And he is in Dubai working for Schluter Graf Legal Counsel since 2009. So he is here for about 12 years. I don't know, 12 years is a long time or not, depends on the situation. And the last but not least, yes, he is a German, but he knows also, of course, English, French, Spanish, and luckily Farsi as well. So I have a chance to talk Farsi with Andres. And his Farsi is better than my German, I hope. So with that, Andres, I hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ali, for the introduction. Very kind introduction, very kind of you. Thank you. Thank you to CoreNet for having me. A pleasure to be here today. Just before we jump into the presentation, a quick reminder on the Q&A. Please address the questions to everyone in the chat function. I believe Ali will be moderating and taking a look at the incoming questions, which will hopefully be able to answer at the end of the session. So let us talk about Lease. I think a lot has been going on in the UAE, in the region, in the world, but we're talking about the UAE today. In the last year, it has already been a year or almost a year since the start of the pandemic. Obviously, as with many events and topics, we're talking about Lease in the current situation, so heavily affected, but what has been going on. There have been a lot of legal changes as well. Just a quick background in addition to what Ali kindly mentioned, just so you know who we are as a firm, in case you haven't heard of Schluter Graf. We're actually, we've been in the region for over 25 years. We're a boutique commercial and corporate firm active in the entire region, Middle Eastern countries, as well as emerging markets in Eastern Africa and Pakistan, advising on all aspects of business law, commercial law, including also rent and lease real estate matters. But enough about us. Let's talk about the actual subject. This is the brief agenda for today. We're going to have roughly half an hour to go through these points. The way I've structured this is basically taking a look at the work from home situation in general, and then the lease contracts, developments in this regard, disputes. So yeah, you can see the individual points. I'm going to go through them. As I said, if you have any questions, do use the chat function, and as we go along, direct them in the chat function. Yeah, so having said that, let's jump in. Work from home will be our first general topic. I saw already, as some of you joined into the virtual meeting room and then turned off the videos, different settings, as is the case usually. So not all of you are in the office, some of you were in the office. Of course, a lot of organizations are in partial work from home scenarios to varying degrees. I want to first look at the legal aspects related to that in the UAE. So as most of you will know, in the UAE, in order to have an operational company, you need to, which is very different to many other jurisdictions, you need to rent an office. It's not just sufficient to have an address that you can register somewhere. It has to be an actual physical office in most cases. And the amount of visas, the quotas that you would get for your visas, for your employees in your organizations are tied to the size, usually in one way or another, to the size of the office space that you have. So free zones and mainland handle this a little bit differently. As a rule of thumb, for free zone companies, you need around 9 square meters for one visa, or 15 square meters per visa if we're talking about a warehouse. Whereas in the mainland, there is no really fixed number. But on the other hand, you do have regular inspections. Nowadays, it's not the Ministry of Labor, or now called Ministry of Human Resources and Emiratization anymore. They've outsourced this to Takim, and you would probably have seen them driving around, or even in your office buildings with some distinct looking uniforms. And they actually do inspect every time you apply for a new visa. And they basically, what they do is they take a look at the facilities. Do you have enough space? Do you have enough workstations, etc., to onboard that new person? So even before the pandemic, it was quite common to have certain exceptions or workarounds for that. Heavily on the rise in the last couple of years is the gig economy. So everything that has to do with sort of flexible freelance arrangements. There have also been some legal changes surrounding this in the last 1 or 2 years. Obviously, on a worldwide scale, that's not a new topic, but due to the sponsorship system here in the region, it is very much still a hot topic. I would say you see a very strong increase in companies focusing on freelance job creation and freelance platforms, online platforms and apps being created, literally shooting up from the ground everywhere, offering more of these sort of services, so that bringing companies together that do not necessarily want to hire fixed positions with freelancers that are just doing different jobs, odd jobs here and there. So this is definitely something to watch. And obviously for freelancers, they're not directly involved, employed by your organization, so you will not need a visa for them. Legally, a lot of topics surrounding that, but I don't think we have enough time to get into that today. You also have mission visas, usually limited to 6 months. So you can bring in somebody from abroad for a limited period of time, renewable, that's a specific visa type that's always available. You have in free zones, in most free zones, you have virtual desks or flexi desks where you just basically rent. It could be as much as one desk or like a small office. And then there's packages offered with a certain number of visas. And last but not least, hosting arrangements, which can have different kinds of contents. But basically what it means is that two companies have an agreement, whereas one company will host a number of employees or one employee for the other company, whereas that employee would actually be working for the other company. Yeah, there's various legal considerations around that, but that's also quite common. That is something that has always been available. And you might wonder if now, considering the almost year or basically a year of ongoing pandemic, has changed anything in that regard. The quick answer is no. So while we have obviously a lot of circulars and instructions from the government and on the respective emirate levels regarding work from home and partially mandatory work from home arrangements, there has until now not been a definitive impact on that principle that ties the number of visas to the office space leased by companies. So at the end of the day, all that I've mentioned until now still applies until now. Right, so those were the visa considerations. Let's jump into employers' rights and obligations, particularly in the context of work from home arrangements. Before going to that specifically, we'll take a very quick general look. So this is regulated, the duty of care by the employer is regulated by the UAE labor law. I've cited here the relevant or some of the relevant articles. Most of this revolves around providing a safe working environment, ensuring that your employees are protected from injury and from health hazards and diseases. And this can, of course, take various shapes and forms depending on which sector your company is in. So, for example, for companies in the construction sector, there's then again very specific further regulations to be observed in terms of workspace on site and respective safety measures, or likewise for medical enterprises and facilities, hospitals, etc. You would have very specific regulations that are then also governed by other entities, Ministry of Health and Prevention, etc. But I think you get the idea. This is just a basic framework, what is laid out here in the labor law, and this can go very, very much deeper in depending on which area, which field you're active in. So the labor law is, on the one hand, provides regulations for that. Of course, many companies, probably many of you, are situated in free zones. Likewise, the regulations, the respective regulations of the free zone authorities will have comparable regulations for health and safety and the duty of care that the employers need to provide. So the JAVSA regulations, for example, do contain that, the IFC contain that, and many others do as well. And in terms of work from home, all of these obligations still apply on the employer, and some to a, let's say, heightened degree, and of course taking into account the different dynamics of work from home scenarios, whereas people are not in the environment that the employer would typically provide, namely the offices or warehouse or whatever other premises you may have, but having people work either from their homes or from other remote locations So then the question is, how do you apply that to those remote locations, and how does the employer ensure their duty of care is being fulfilled? So you have, to a certain extent, in some of the resolutions from last year surrounding these topics, I've named here Resolution 281 from last year, that strictly and clearly requires that employers provide technical facilities to actually enable this kind of remote work. I think for many companies, this was not a big issue. I know for a lot of companies, for a lot of clients of mine, even larger operations, that was a big change, because not all staff were used to working from remote places. I mean, typically you would have people that work on sites, or sales staff that are on the go. So for them, they have their laptops, they work from anywhere, and that's not a big issue. But for a lot of other staff, admin, managerial, and other categories, they would typically only work or predominantly work from their offices. So there was quite a shift, and just facilitating those technical means and to enable that remote work. That was a challenge for a lot in the beginning. I think something that most companies solved in a very short amount of time. But in particular, I would also draw attention to the following topics that need to be ensured by employers in this work from home scenario. So employees need to be able to log on to secure systems. So you need to provide, of course, the hardware and connectivity to servers, etc., in a secure way. Employers should definitely also check insurance topics with regard to personal injuries that can be sustained from home or from other locations. So typically, this is something that your insurance will probably already cover for sites, etc. But if we're talking about from home, this is something to be looked at. Then another point is, how are employees supervised while working from home? There's all sorts of HR topics and team work aspects to be considered here. How do you ensure people can talk to each other? How do you ensure people can submit their work, and etc., and be supervised appropriately? Obviously, Zoom, the platform that we're on right now, and other platforms such as Teams and many others have done a great job of enabling that. So I think we're all used to that by now. At the same time, you need to think about confidential information. So also obligations that the company and your organization may have, not only towards the employee, but also towards third parties. So if people are all of a sudden working removed from their usual work environment, and then they're in a completely different private setting or somewhere outside, you need to think about that. So the confidentiality of your information and maybe your client's information needs to be preserved. And yeah, last but not least, obviously some sort of policy should be put in place and ideally communicated and agreed with employees in writing. I would assume that most of you and most organizations have this in place, but obviously something to keep in mind here is that we're seeing, as we'll see in the following slides as well, basically weekly, sometimes daily updates and changes to this. So this can be quite challenging for the responsible people and teams in the organizations to monitor this from an HR and employment perspective, and also from other perspectives. So it's really important to keep a lookout for the new developments and to stay abreast of what is happening legally. Now, I want to address one topic which is quite current and very hot and also hotly debated in the legal community, which is the question of what happens with the vaccinations, and should companies force or maybe just encourage their employees to take the vaccine, whichever vaccine is available. Right now, it seems that there's not a lot of availability at the moment, or only for certain categories. In general, I would say it's still safe to say that the vaccine is absolutely voluntary, but there have been a lot of measures taken over the last weeks, which are really pushing towards a factual requirement for having the vaccine for some or most employees. So let me outline that for you in a little bit more detail. So towards the end, or at the end of the last day of last year, we had Circular 16 requiring mandatory COVID testing every 14 weeks for all government entities in Abu Dhabi. This was then very quickly, less than a week later, updated, and it was made mandatory to be tested every 7 days. And then most recently on the 9th of February, so last week, the DED in Abu Dhabi extended this requirement to all establishments. So that means also to all private companies. This is very new. I came across this a couple of days ago. I know some companies have already received this circular. However, I know of other companies that are still, as of yesterday, we're still not aware of this. The decree or the circular, I believe it is quite short, and it's also unclear what happens if you do not comply with the testing, and how the authorities might check and control this. But I think it is a very interesting development, because now it's not only for the government sector and the public sector, it is, at least in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, it is mandatory for all. And what does this mean? I think it's safe to say that apart from the health reasons that most people would see for pro-vaccination in these circumstances, it is maybe also now commercially and operations-wise necessary for employers to at least encourage employees to get vaccinated. Your employees may not have access to certain sites and offices if they're not vaccinated, or they may not be able to get tested in time or repeatedly tested on a regular basis to just go about their regular business. However, just to really point that out, these recent developments were mostly in Abu Dhabi. So it depends also on which emirate you're operating in, or if you have different entities in the UAE, then different rules may apply depending on where your employees and your entities are located. And just maybe to wrap that part up, in terms of how to go about this and how far your obligations as obligations of employers, of companies go, or what you can legally do rather, it is still, I would say, legally not possible and not advisable to issue a mandatory instruction to employees requiring them to get vaccinated. So as I said in the beginning of this mini topic, vaccinations are still voluntary, and you cannot force your employees to take the vaccine. However, I've seen the questions raised by many companies, but we need to ensure that our people can work. We need to have schedules for people that are vaccinated that we can place on different tasks that they may be doing. So that is a real topic. At the current time, I would still say the safest way to go about this is to issue some sort of statement that encourages the same, but that makes it clear that there will be no repercussions if employees are not getting the vaccine. And at the current state, not everybody can get the vaccine. Another topic that is controversial and not very clear in connection with this, if you want to have an idea of which employees are vaccinated and can be deployed for certain tasks and which are not, you may need to store this information, at least in your HR department. and that from a data privacy point of view is problematic. So in order to be on the safe side, if you need or want to do that, it would probably be a good idea to have some sort of consent to really just avoid any doubt in this regard. But this is a topic that depends also on the circumstances of each case, of each company, how they operate. So that is quite an issue. I think we'll be seeing more circulars and more debate around this in the coming weeks. I would be surprised if it's not addressed also in Dubai and maybe also on a federal level. So I do expect some sort of further legal clarification on this. So again, one of the points to really have an ear and a lookout for to see what the developments in this regard are. Having said that, I would now like to jump to lease contracts, a quick look at lease contracts, and then in a bit more detail, we'll talk about force majeure clauses and disputes. And so here you have just a very general overview of the laws that are governing leases in the UAE. So you have the civil code, and then you have on different Emirates. I've cited here some laws from Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Obviously, there's in the other Emirates other laws that may be applicable, and all of these laws have been expanded, and there's other laws that are applicable. But just to give you a rough idea, there's a lot of regulations. So depending on where you are, and then depending on later on if you might have a dispute, and there's other laws to consider. But there is a developing framework for this in the UAE, and depending on each emirate, you have quite detailed requirements on how to deal with this. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide in terms of breaking current leases, terminating. So just, I think important to note, you cannot unilaterally break a lease unless you have a very clear negotiated contractual right to do so. So you need to, if you want to change the terms of your lease, or if you want to break the lease, you need to agree with your counterpart, or you will be liable to damages. So basically that's it. I mean, also in terms of negotiations, I would like to just comment on a few trends that we are observing. Definitely, if you are looking to shift offices, combine offices, consolidate in whatever shape or form, we can see a clear trend of landlords being open to negotiations. In the current environment, we see a lot of areas that are actually gaining demand, but I would say overall, the trend due to the economic impacts of the pandemic are in a way that landlords are keen on to keep tenants happy, and they're offering rent-free periods and rent reductions. And generally, the feedback that we get and what we have seen with many of our clients is that there's a lot of room for negotiation. And yeah, that means for those of you who are tenants and who have some demands in terms of maybe shifting or changing their office structure, this is a good time to negotiate with your landlord. Coming now to the disputes, very briefly outlining the way disputes in commercial and also private leases work. So you have to distinguish between strictly leasing topics and lease topics that are then governed by certain special committees. Again, depending on which emirate you are, there may be specific requirements. Primarily Abu Dhabi and Dubai have their very distinct setups, and they have laws governing these rental dispute centers and the respective committees with different instances in those committees. They differ between the emirates. So that's something to really bear in mind. You have to go to those committees. You can't just go to the courts in Dubai or Abu Dhabi or in the other emirates. There's a very distinct mechanism for that. And Just also maybe recapping a little bit of the practice of the courts and the committees in the last year. So initially we saw very quick decisions towards the beginning of the pandemic, where Abu Dhabi and Dubai suspended evictions from facilities, as I said, very early on, but this has now been brought back to normal procedures. So there's no more suspension in place in this regard. So from what we can tell, in most cases, these cases are being considered as regular cases. Obviously, the pandemic still plays a role here, as we'll discuss now in the next couple of slides, in terms of force majeure. So force majeure, what is force majeure? Most of you by now, if you weren't aware of it before, I think must be aware now in the wake of the pandemic. This has been widely discussed. Force majeure, a force majeure event is an unexpected circumstance outside the control of a party and preventing the party or the parties from carrying out their obligations, and then resulting in some form of hardship. So typically many commercial contracts would include a force majeure clause, and then describing some sort of mechanism how to deal with force majeure. And typically the mechanism is that during a certain limited period of force majeure, there would be no penalty or liability on the party that is affected by force majeure and cannot fulfill their contractual obligations. It is important to say that the standard form, the Jari contract, does not include a force majeure clause. However, many lease agreements, if they're drafted as a bespoke contract, they will include that, and they should include that. So that's something also to consider if you're negotiating or renegotiating a lease. Then this is something that should definitely be one of your checkpoints to make sure there's an adequate clause for force majeure, which should then also specifically mention force majeure and the force majeure in events of pandemic, because this is something that was missing in many clauses, and that now I think almost everybody's just making sure, okay, let's put that word pandemic and also epidemic in there to make sure that this would be covered then by the force majeure clause. Here in this slide and the following slides, I've just outlined a few of the provisions from the UAE Civil Code, which also recognize this context. So it's mentioned in Article 249, it's mentioned in Article 273 and 287. So basically all of them in some form recognizing this concept of force majeure. And it's safe to say that this is not only a recognized principle in the UAE in terms of the law, but also in terms of the jurisprudence. I've mentioned here there's a couple of Court of Cassation, the Dubai Court of Cassation judgments that have confirmed this. There's other judgments as well. But the one judgment that I do want to talk about is a judgment from last year that has been widely reported and discussed in the legal community. This was in front of the Dubai Rental Committee, which held that COVID-19 can be considered a valid reason for terminating a lease. Now, it's important to note, this does not open the floodgates for relying on force majeure if you want to get out of a lease agreement. This was a very specific case. This was for a private individual and his private lease, and that individual had lost his job and then said, okay, he could not afford to continue paying the lease and therefore had to terminate the lease. And in that case, that was considered by the committee and accepted as a valid reason. But this does not necessarily mean that this would apply on commercial leases or on other kind of commercial contracts. It's very important to note that. For those of you who've been here long enough, you may remember looking back at the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, and the effects this had on Dubai. And there was also much talk of, or many companies or people tried to invoke force majeure, and they said, especially also in the real estate sector, said that, okay, this was unforeseen and this is force majeure. I should be allowed to terminate my contract with a developer, for example, if I've invested in a real estate project. And the clear stance taken by the authorities and the courts at that time was that in the vast majority of cases, this was not considered force majeure. We do see a raise in cases, and I expect further raise in cases where this will be coming up as force majeure, in disputes where parties will try to rely on force majeure. Most likely this will be more towards commercial agreements. In terms of leases, you may have, and we've seen also a trend where this is being invoked for at least the lockdown periods last year. So some of you may already have that, experience. We've seen cases where companies have successfully negotiated lease reductions, rent reductions for the lockdown periods and other periods where they were not able to use their facilities. So that is something that we have seen, and I do expect an increase in this regard. Now, just to wrap it up, also to leave some time for some questions that may have been asked in the chat function. I would say it's important to know that while there have been a large number of circulars and decrees passed in the last year and also starting this year, with effect on how your business operations, HR, and then also indirectly on your leases, the current legal framework has not fundamentally changed because of that. So you need to stick to the contracts and the terms that you've agreed to in your contracts, and the laws need to be observed. Companies should really monitor the current situation and formulate or reformulate and revise their policies regarding work from home and related practices. This also includes the topic of vaccinations that I mentioned. I do expect a lot of development in this regard. There will be the requirement, depending on which industry you're in, to react to that. And I do also expect that there will be some legal changes in the form of decrees and circulars announced in this regard. So keep your eye open for that. And then, yeah, of course, as we just discussed at the end, force majeure clauses and termination options should be really looked at carefully when negotiating or renegotiating your commercial contracts, and in particular also your lease contracts. With that, I would like to conclude and hand back over to Ali for the Q&A. At this point, thank you very much for your attention. And yeah, if I don't know, Ali, if we have some questions.
Good. Thank you, Andres. That was very great topics. And I have been faced with all these points that you mentioned during the last 6 months. And sometimes I was the winner and sometimes I was the loser in my negotiation. So let's see. So, we have some questions in the chat function, and again, please raise your questions in the chat functions as soon as possible and send to everyone. So there are 2 questions from Morgan. The first one, he mentioned that since the number of working from home, I think it's much higher than before, these employer obligations and legislation, it's old and did not consider so many people being at home. Is it true that it is old and it's not updated?
Correct. That's absolutely correct. And it is, that's what I tried to mention. The old regulations still apply. And I would expect, in particular in Dubai, but perhaps also in the other Emirates, to be some sort of correction, because the UAE and the different Emirates have taken a lot of measures to attract businesses and to make it more interesting for foreign investors to stay or to come to the UAE. So this is obviously an old requirement that you need to have a large office if you have to have a certain workforce and sponsor them. And that's something that I wouldn't be surprised if we see some changes there also in the official position in the form of some decrees and laws affecting some change in this regard.
Okay, thank you. And the second question from Morgan, that does you talk about the testing and necessary of the testing if they want to go to the office, but the question is, does the testing only apply to employees who are going to work from the office, or also apply for the others as well?
Very good question. If you look at the circular that was passed on the 9th of February, it's extremely short. It's a one-pager from the DED, which also begs the question. The DED is the licensing authority, so it's not related to employment. It's not related to health. So how they will enforce that, how that will be applied in detail, I think that remains to be seen. In terms of also how they will supervise and control which employees take the test, that's something to be seen. But I would assume that if you're working from home and you're not going to the office, then how should you be supervised, and how should that be checked? So there's still, as I said, there's still a lot of uncertainty around this. And certainly we will, as Schlüter Graf, we will try to clarify this with the authorities, in this case with the DED in Abu Dhabi. And yeah, it's important to note that this applies only to Abu Dhabi at this stage.
Okay, thank you so much. So we have another question from John, that are we likely to see changes to existing force majeure terms and conditions in other contracts, such as construction?
So yeah, like I said, I think there is a clear trend towards putting an emphasis on force majeure and related clauses in contracts. So I've already seen that. We've seen that numerous times over the last 12 months. People are checking their clauses, and then when drafting new contracts, they are putting a strong emphasis on force majeure clauses. So as we all know, there is a freedom of contract. So in contracts, you can basically, as long as it doesn't go against the law, you can agree on anything. So you're free to agree on whatever you wish in a force majeure clause. But I think it's important to point out that this topic or this question does not only concern the force majeure clauses themselves. This is also relevant for other aspects of the contract. So for example, termination clauses that offer you an exit, yeah, in terms of force majeure. This is somehow usually combined with force majeure, but maybe you want to have a right to terminate for convenience, or right to suspend works, or right to suspend payment in terms of such situations. So there's a lot of other places in a contract where you could and probably should do some modifications, and if you want to be careful in this regard, not just the force majeure clauses.
Okay, thank you. One question from Khaldoon. Who will be held responsible for any health complications if an employer forced employee to get vaccinated?
I think, yeah, I doubt there's any precedent for such cases, but my understanding of the current situation is that it's clearly not legal to force employees to get vaccinated. So if you then in turn think about it and force an employee as a company, and that person has some health issues as a result of that, then I would say it's not unlikely that the liability will fall on the company, on the employer.
Good, thank you so much. Actually, there is no other questions in the chat functions, and there are a lot of people. Thank you, Andres, for such a very informative information that I think we all dealing with that day by day. And thank you very much. And I think time-wise, we are going to close the session. And before that, again, we appreciate and thank all our sponsors: Summertown, Blue House, Technion, JLL, Horton Tech, Gensler, Herman Miller, and Interface. Thank you for all participants, and I hope that you have a great day and weeks ahead, and keep health, keep safe, and see you on next event, inshallah, next month. And thank you, Andres, for your lovely presentation as well. Have a good day and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.